gold. And when you think about the fact that this soil probably took hundreds of years to form,
Hello, my name is Christine Brown. I'm a field crop sustainability specialist.
all right, welcome. On behalf of Christine Brown, myself, Andrew Barry, and the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food, and Agribusiness, we would love to welcome you to the 2025 March Manure Mondays. You may have caught the name change in what I just said. We are now a different ministry. We're the Ministry of Agriculture, Food, and Agribusiness, and Rural Affairs is now a separate ministry. You know, in a rapidly changing world with often confusing things going on, isn't it great that collaboratively we can show up here, we can talk about manure, we can talk about how to manage it well, and we can do that with folks like yourselves from jurisdictions from all over the world. So with that in mind, I'd love it to start off if you would tell us in the chat who you are, where you are listening in from today. That would be awesome. As you're doing that, I do want to mention as well, we have in the background Quinn Harder. Quinn shows up as the OMAFRA field crop team, and kind of great to have Quinn back. Quinn was our summer student back in 2021 when we hosted the North American Manure Expo in Listowel, Ontario. So it's great to have the team all back together. So what have we got in store for you this year? Funny enough, there are 5 Mondays in March this year, so that gives us 5 topics. And we're going to give you a total mixed ration of topics throughout the month. It will include nutrient availability. It'll include technology such as the Rain 360. It'll include compaction and also greenhouse gases. So we are really looking forward to our topics. Few quick logistical things. Just remember, we do stop at the end of the hour, so presentation will go from 40 to 60 minutes, questions at the end, and those questions will come from you primarily as you post them in the chat. We love hearing your comments and your questions in the chat, but please do stay muted as we don't want to hear your dog. So thank you for joining us. Also, just so you know, we do offer certified education units. So if you are a certified crop advisor, that QR code will be posted at the end, and it will either be a professional development or a soil and water quality. Okay, enough talk. It's time to rock. Let's get into today's topic. And the topic today is manure storages and methane. And we are thrilled to have Andrew VanderZaag with us. Andrew is a research scientist at Agriculture and Agrifood Canada. And Andrew, I believe you're coming at us today from our nation's capital in beautiful Ottawa, Ontario. So I'm going to turn it over to Andrew, and he'll go through the presentation, and then we'll circle back to questions at the end. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks a lot. Yes, I'm a research scientist here in Ottawa, and thanks for the introduction. Glad to be here. Going to talk about methane from manure management, which kind of fits under the greenhouse gases envelope, which you mentioned. And I just wanted to start by kind of providing some context on that. So there are three key greenhouse gases from agriculture and from manure management. Methane's one of them, nitrous oxide is the second, and ammonia the third, which is an indirect nitrous oxide source of nitrous oxide. When we're talking about liquid manure, because the carbon is stored in anaerobic conditions, methane is the primary source of total greenhouse gases from that. If solid manure is kind of a different situation because it's a mixture of aerobic and anaerobic conditions. So there's a mixture of nitrous oxide, ammonia, and methane from that. So, so for liquid manure, it's really all about methane. And why is that important? Well, if we think about the calculations that have been done that provide estimates of the carbon footprint of milk, for example, suggest that methane emissions contribute about 20% of that carbon footprint. And for pork production, can be around half of the carbon footprint. So pretty significant contribution. And also important, I think, is that this is the methane is all coming from one concentrated point source, the manure storage, and it's already a source it's already something that's managed by the farm directly. Basically an engineered system that's designed to do certain functions, and I think there's a high potential for mitigation. So I'm going to talk about two research questions that I've been working on for more than 15 years now. The first one is how much methane is actually produced. So I just told you some numbers about the carbon footprint. Those are calculations based on assumptions and estimates. But for a country as large as Canada, for instance, we have very few actual measurements of methane. So that's the first question. How much is actually being produced? And then the second thing is, how can we potentially reduce methane? And not just one way, not expecting one best way, but we want to have like a menu of options, because there's lots of farmers that are optimizing different things. Every farm has its own context and situation, and we need options that work for a variety of farms. So on to the first part of the presentation about how much methane is actually produced. I'm going to kind of give an overview of a number of studies that we've done. This just there's more studies than this, but I picked some contrasting areas. So a dairy farm up near Edmonton, Alberta, in the prairies, a dairy farm near Ottawa, which is a fairly warm part of Canada, and some swine operations in around Brandon, Manitoba, and another further south in Manitoba as well. And so these have different temperatures and different climates, and that's going to come up several times. But how we're actually measuring the emissions of methane is something I want to touch on here. And we're using a really non-invasive approach. It takes a long time to find the ideal sites that really meet all the criteria that we're looking for: flat land without other sources around, wind coming from a certain direction. But essentially, if we find all those criteria, then we can use an open path methane sensor, which passes a specific wavelength of light to a reflector. Then that is returned to the laser, and it's able to measure the integrated average concentration along that path, upwind or downwind or both, of the source of the storage. And then we can determine if there's methane being emitted, then the concentration downwind will be higher than the concentration upwind. And we also have specialized anemometer that measures the wind conditions, so we can use the measurement of how much the concentration increased as the wind passed over the storage, combined with the wind statistics and a dispersion model. Because we know the methane is coming from the storage itself and not from the fields, then we can work out what the emission rate is. And the upside of this is that there's relatively low power. There's no pumps, there's no tubing for mice to chew through, for example. And so we can keep these systems running for a very long time, for years, and they're measuring almost constantly. So as we're giving this presentation, we're going through this presentation, we'll get more data points at the farms where these systems are running right now. So the first farm I'm going to talk about is a dairy farm with about 160 cows that they're milking near Ottawa. So the mean annual temperature, just for context, here in Ottawa is 6.4 degrees Celsius. And this farm typically empties their manure in the spring and fall. So you can see in the bottom left, the picture of the laser, that's measuring the methane downwind of the manure tank. There's also some sensors measuring the temperature and how much manure is in the storage at any given time. So this shows some results, and I want to start on the left, which kind of illustrates how these sensors are measuring things all the time. So we noticed, looking at the data, that we would see high emissions of methane sometimes first thing in the morning, like 8 o'clock in the morning. So we looked at the time-lapse cameras, and we could see that bubbles were forming on the surface of the manure in the morning. And when the sun was shining and started heating up the surface, then all those bubbles would burst, and that's when the methane would be produced. So you could see the yellow line increasing there. So that just gives you a sense of we're measuring all the time, so we can see details like this. But then we can also roll all those numbers up together and get monthly values, which is what I'm showing on the right. So that is a stack of graphs. The top one is temperature. The next one down is the amount of manure that's in the storage. The one below that is how much volatile solids is in the manure, which is a measure of how much, it gives us an indication of how much carbon there is. And then the bottom one is the methane production. So what we can see in the first year, 2013, is when the temperature of the manure increases in July and August, and the volume of manure in the storage is also at its maximum, that is when we get the peak methane production. So there's hardly any methane in June. They're starting to increase in July and August. That's the peak. And then in September, the manure is put out in the field, or part of the manure was put in the field. And that's when methane dropped down. So that year we got a peak of methane production in August, because that's when there was the most manure in the storage plus warm temperature. The next year, 2014, similar temperature pattern, but the volume of manure was different because of the amount that was applied in the spring. And so the manure was not emptied until November. And that gives, in the bottom right, a curve of methane production that peaks in September instead of August, and it continues producing in October and even into November. So there's more methane produced in November than there was in June. So it highlights the importance of the volume of manure in storage during the warm period of the year. So temperature is really important, as I keep talking about the warm period of the year. And this is a temperature response graph from that data set, actually from the following year. And what you can see is temperature, which is along the bottom, and methane emissions, which is moving upwards, forms a relationship. And the bottom left of the graph is 0 methane emissions and 15 degrees Celsius. So that's kind of a approximate number that we can use to give us a sense of when methane is going to start being produced, which is about above 15 degrees Celsius, and when it won't be, which is below 15 degrees. And this is the temperature of the manure, not the air. So talking about methane being emitted, I talked a little bit about bubbles earlier. Something that we've seen many times is the release of a lot of methane when the manure is mixed during agitation. So the graph on the left shows agitation. We get an increase of methane for that period of agitation. The amount of emissions increases drastically. Another thing that happens at the same time is shown in the middle, which is that the temperature pattern, the temperature profile during mixing changes. And so the lower depths, which tend to be cooler, increase in temperature. And so we did a study where we intentionally mixed the tank with an agitator several times during the summer. And what we saw was that the temperature was warmer that year because of the mixing. And also we measured the activity level of methanogens using microbial techniques. And we could see that with repeated mixing, the activity of methanogens in the summer was higher than the year before when the manure was not mixed through the summer. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about measurements that we did in Alberta. So this is a little bit of a smaller dairy farm. So they're milking about 90 cows. The average air temperature annually there is colder, so 2.7 degrees Celsius. There's a shorter warm season and it doesn't get as warm compared to Ottawa. And also they only remove manure from the storage once a year in the fall. It's an earthen storage. You can see the setup there. So what does it look like through 1 year? So what we can see in the pictures across the top corresponds to what the surface looks like at different times of the year. This is 1 year. The top graph is the temperature and the blue dots are the air temperature. And you can see in the spring and early summer, the air temperature is much warmer than the manure temperature. And then not until September does the manure temperature, which is the black dots, finally reach a peak. And it is just getting over 15 degrees Celsius in the manure at that point. And when the manure temperature reaches a peak, that's also when we see the methane emissions, the red dots. Each of those is the daily average. So the methane production peaks when the manure temperature peaks. And that occurred in September. And the bottom panel shows the increasing amount of manure in the storage, which drops in November when the manure was applied. So that's the pattern over 1 year of measurements. And if we make some assumptions about what was happening in the winter, and we didn't have the sensors operating, we can get a graph that shows us the estimated combination of estimated and measured cumulative methane over the entire year. And we actually continued doing that for 6 years. And you could see a representative picture of the surface in each of the years on the top. And following the same order is the methane emissions each week of the warm season in the graph on the bottom. And so if we just looked at the top, you might notice that 2015, you've got a pretty dry surface crust. 2021, a really dry surface crust, which also has plants growing out of it. Whereas 2017 had basically a liquid surface. And then if we look at the methane graph below, you can see really high methane production in 2015 and 2021, and relatively lower methane in 2017 and the other years. Now, what's the difference between these years? One of the things, if you look at the headlines, is just the really extreme heat wave that occurred in 2015 and 2021. Records were set during the heat dome. And so the temperature was just a little bit warmer in the manure and much warmer in the air for a couple of weeks. And that led to more methane production in those 2 years. And the effect of it was quite substantial. So more than double the amount of methane production in the 2 years with heat waves compared to the rest of the years. So again, temperature is a really key parameter in driving methane production. And just to put the two farms together on the same graph, just from 1 year each. So we have Ontario in gray and Alberta in red. That's the temperature. We can see that in Ontario, the temperature in the manure is getting over 15 degrees for several months, whereas in Alberta, it's just barely reaching over 15. And so we get, as expected, much more methane production per unit of carbon or per unit of manure that's in the storage when it's warmer in Ontario. Now moving on to the swine operations. So this was a study we started in 2016 at a finishing barn near Brandon, Manitoba. And it's an earthen storage that, again, manure is pumped out once a year in the fall. The average air temperature here, just for comparison, is 4.1 degrees Celsius. There was also a change in farm ownership partway through the study. So the sensors were operating during the spring, summer, and fall through this 3 years. And again, we got the pictures across the top, so you could see in the winter there's not a lot of manure in the storage. It's also frozen on top. In the summer, we have basically a liquid surface, and the temperature is starting to warm up. It doesn't really get much above 15 degrees. It gets above 15 in the manure storage for about 6 weeks. And but we also see from the graph that in 2016 we had much higher emissions than the other 2 years. And as I mentioned, there was a change in farm ownership. And so this study confirmed that we had a shorter period of time where methane would be produced, but it also led to more questions about why there was this variability year to year. In this case, it was not temperature driven. So we were fortunate to be able to do a follow-up study. This is funded by the Swine Research Cluster and industry partnerships. And so started this in 2023. Found some really nice finishing barns to work at. And in this time, we have methane sensors measuring emissions year-round from the barns as well as from the manure storage outside. So we have the short-term manure storage under the barn and the long-term manure storage outside. And this particular farm has a multi-cell storage. So the manure flows into the first cell, overflows to the second cell, and then into the third cell. And we have sensors on all of those. And here I'm just summarizing the emissions from all of the barns as blue and all of the outdoor storages combined in red, and showing it over a year. So what we can see is during the winter time, when the outside temperature is cold, we don't get much methane emitted from the outdoor storage, but we do continue to get emissions from under the barn, even though it's a very short period of time that the manure is stored under the barn. So actually during like January and February, there's similar or even more methane being produced from the barn than there is from the outside storages. But in July and August, that's when the outside temperature, the storage temperature increases, and there's a higher volume of manure in storage, and that's when the majority of the outdoor emissions occurred. So that provides some context for how mitigation could be approached. We really need to focus on the period of time when emissions are at their max for like 2 or 3 months, and that could make a big reduction in the total emissions at this operation. So some key findings from the farm measurements that we've done. Number one, methane production is very sensitive to the manure temperature. And related to that, cooler places and cooler years produce methane for less time. And the less manure there actually is in the storage during the summer or during the warmest part of the year, the less methane there will be. And finally, the transport of methane is affected by bubbles and mixing, but that's different than the production. So the microbes are the ones producing the methane, and then the methane has to get out of the manure, which tends to occur through bubbles. So the graph on the bottom kind of shows an idealized pattern of what emissions tend to look like in climates like in Canada, where we have cold winters. And the width of that will depend on how long the winter is or how long the summer is. So the second part of the talk, I'm going to focus on mitigation options. And I've put some ideas here and try to arrange them according to some idea of increasing or decreasing capital cost to install and the expected amount of methane emission reduction. And I'll kind of go through these on the next slide, following slides. So biogas is probably the first thing that comes to mind. So anaerobic digestion. If we've got methane coming out of this tank, why not cover it, collect the methane, and use it? It's a good idea. And it's shown to definitely reduce methane emissions compared to having a liquid storage on its own. But I think ultimately, if you build a digester, you're then going to increase the temperature, you're going to optimize the conditions to produce even more methane. So then it becomes very important that the system is designed for the purpose of mitigating methane emissions. So, and then we also have to consider that whatever goes into the digester, the majority of that is also the similar volume is going to come out of the digester as digestate. And that, depending on the design, will still have considerable amount of methane potential. So digestate storage becomes an important consideration. And we spent a number of years doing measurements at biodigester, on-farm digesters, using the lasers like I described. And from that, we published a paper that highlighted where the methane was coming from on these operations. So we've got some leakage from the facilities themselves, from over under pressure valves and things like that. Also, there can be some pass through from the generator, some unburned methane going through the flare, as well as methane being produced in the digestate storage. So when we put all those together as a percentage of the amount of methane that was collected as biogas used in the for a purpose, we can see that digestate, the brown portion of the pie chart, is the biggest contributor. And at a second facility, we see that again. So the digestate storage is the largest contributor of methane emissions from the facility. So there's still opportunity for reducing methane from the digestate. And also, the second example highlights that there was some methane being lost from the facility itself that was able to be repaired. And after the repair, the fugitive losses from the dome was much lower. So so digestate's an important consideration for biogas. I'm gonna just quickly mention a couple of methods that are gonna be relevant to the following slides. So when we're testing mitigation options, some of them we can test in the lab, and the lab is nice because we can compare a lot of treatments. Each of the bottles in that incubator is a replicate or a different treatment. And we can do lots of different rates, and we can control temperatures in multiple incubators. So it gives us lots of opportunities to control some of the variables. But on the other hand, what's going on inside of a bottle, even if it's 500 milliliters of manure, that's not representative of what's happening on a farm. So the next higher scale is a pilot study, and the facility that is shown in the picture on the bottom is where we've done some pilot testing. Started with my PhD there. Rob Gordon established that site. And essentially what it looks like, 6 greenhouses. Each of those is a chamber that enables the sunlight to go in. It enables the airflow through the chamber to be controlled. So we can measure the emissions of multiple gases from each of those tanks. So the greenhouses are sitting on top of a miniature manure tank that holds about 10 tons of manure. So that gives us the ability to have a little bit of replication and a much bigger scale. So at that pilot scale site, we tested a number of floating permeable covers. So you can see the dairy manure on the left is the control. Then the straw covers shown in the middle, were either 15 or 30 centimeters thick. And this is really idealized because the cover was perfectly matched wall to wall on the surface. It never blew over to one side. It never sank. We did add water over top, but it stayed with 100% coverage 100% of the time. And with that, we saw 90% emission reductions for ammonia and 25% reductions of methane for the 30 centimeter thick straw cover. And but nitrous oxide was increased, which then made the greenhouse gas emission reduction smaller to 20%. So if a perfect cover could be maintained, there is potential emission reductions. Basically, what has to happen is you have to create an environment where it can become a biofilter. So there's organisms that will basically consume methane and oxidize it to CO2. And that requires that the methane has to pass through slowly, and the cover has to be in place long enough that those organisms can become established and very active. And we were able to do that in this case. But is it possible on a full farm scale? I'm not sure. The geotextile cover on the right, that's recycled foam glued to a geotextile membrane. That was very effective for reducing ammonia loss, but did not reduce methane emissions. So it's not enough retention time, I think. The gases pass through it too quickly. What about natural crusts? So this is something where we've studied this just by observing it at farms, like I showed earlier with the data from Alberta. Here is another example. We have a very thick crust there. And yet when we go around it with the methane sensor, we see high concentrations of methane in September. So that's saying that methane is still being produced and it's still finding a way out, probably through cracks. Methane is very low solubility, so it'll find its way out if it's possible, if it's not completely sealed. This might be a different story in places without winter, where the crust can really become solid and they last all year round. But in Canada, where we have these seasonal cycles, it doesn't seem like a high opportunity for reduction. But they definitely do decrease ammonia loss. Just wanted to mention about covered storages. Two types of covers. So there's permeable covers that I just was mentioning, the research on, which lets water pass through. Then these are impermeable. So we also have on the left a system that's collecting the gas underneath. And then if the gas is collected, something has to be done with it. It either has to be flared or pass through an optimized biofilter to convert the methane into CO2. So that requires maintenance and needs to be well designed for that to work. Passive systems, which basically just stop rain from going in and stop the wind from blowing across, those will prevent ammonia emissions because ammonia is soluble, but it's unlikely that those are going to stop methane production because methane will find its way out. Aeration is something that just started to look at. And here's a picture of an aerated dairy manure storage. So the aerator turns on automatically on a specific cycle. There's aeration points all throughout the tank. By default, the system was operating 6 hours a day, not all in a row. It's spread out throughout the day and night. And so we measured an indicator of how anaerobic or aerobic the manure was, and that's called ORP, or redox potential. And negative 330 is what we measured when it was being aerated 6 hours a day. And we measured around the tank with a methane sensor, and we still found lots of methane was being produced. So that's still an anaerobic environment, even though it's a little bit less anaerobic than an unaerated tank. The farmer then increased the aeration rate to 12 hours a day, and then the ORP became less negative, negative 256, which is getting closer to a zone where methane might not be produced. but it's still anaerobic enough that there was methane being produced. And when we went around with the sensor, there was still quite a bit of methane around the tank. So it's possible that this is having a mitigation effect, but it's certainly not stopping methane completely. Another thing that we've done some research on is solid liquid separation. So on the top left, that's a picture of a screw press, which is in this case connected to a continuous composting system to produce bedding. And the reason why this might reduce methane emissions is because by extracting the fiber out of the manure, the coarse solids, you're taking carbon out of the anaerobic portion and storing it in an aerobic form in this compost. And so the liquid fraction ends up with less carbon in it, which means there's less potential for methane production. So that's good. But something that we can see in the graph in the bottom left here is that if we look at methane, which is on the vertical axis, and time on the horizontal axis, the orange line is the separated liquid, and the blue line is the methane production from manure that has not been separated from the same farm. And so then after about 60 days, we see the two lines intersect, and after that, the separated liquid is producing less methane, and the unseparated manure is producing more. So this is showing that eventually the separated liquid will produce less methane, in this case 27% less, but at first it's going to produce more. And we've done this study at different temperatures. We can see that at lower temperatures it even takes longer. So the net effect of having separation depends on the temperature and how long it's stored for. Nutrient recovery is a more straightforward result. It's a more substantial investment. It basically not only separates the coarse fibers, but also the fine solids. So it removes even more carbon out of the liquid fraction. And the study that we did showed that after separation, the liquid portion that was left had no methane production. So we've been talking about biodigestion, talking about separating, talking about surface processes. This is a study that highlights how those different factors impact ammonia emissions. So this is one of the main losses of nitrogen from livestock operations is into the atmosphere from ammonia gas. So this is 4 different farms. We've got the farm in the top left has no biodigester and no screw press. That farm has a thick crust on the surface. It's a dairy farm. These are all dairy farms. And we can see the ammonia emissions throughout the year. The peak is less than 20. So let's keep that number in our heads. Moving to the top right, this is a farm without a digester and with a screw press. So there's a lot less surface crust because the fibers have been taken out. And in this case, the peak ammonia emissions are close to 30. So it's higher. The bottom left, we have a biodigester without a screw press. Now the ammonia emissions are higher again, close to 60. I should mention that biodigestion increases the amount of ammonia N generally, and also increases the pH. And both of those things will tend to increase the potential for ammonia loss, combined with the fact there's very little crust on the surface. And the fourth one, with also adding the screw press, so there's really no surface crusting, has the highest ammonia emissions. So again, methane and ammonia, they're both important in these liquid systems. Some considerations around temperature as a potential mitigation option depends on the farming system. If it's a system that has temporary storage under the barn and then a long-term storage outside, in the winter time when the outside storage is colder and the under barn storage is warmer, moving the manure from the warm to the cold will be a mitigation strategy that will end up with less methane production. Another option that may be beneficial in some places where there's a lot of precipitation, especially, is a roof with open sides. And that basically, we've done some small scale measurements as well as developed a model to simulate these effects. And both of those showed that having this type of roof design that allows the wind to blow through to allow evaporation to occur and cooling, but meanwhile blocking direct solar radiation, will result in a lower manure temperature. And what we can see from the lab study in the top right, decreasing the temperature by even 3 degrees will potentially delay methane production by a month or more. Some other lab studies that we've done have shown how low doses of sulfuric acid, and by which I mean decreasing the pH by about 1 pH unit in the manure, can be very effective to reduce methane. The graph shows that sulfuric acid had almost a 90% emission reduction over more than 150 days. Adding other types of acid that do not have sulfate were much less effective. But adding sulfate in the form of gypsum without acidity had an over 50% reduction. So there's a combination effect of the acidity and the sulfate, which work together synergistically for the sulfuric acid. We tested the acidification with sulfuric acid at the pilot scale. Decreasing the pH by less than a unit resulted in almost 90% methane emission reduction over 6 months. You can see visually lots of bubbles in the control tank and no bubbles in the acidified tank. And as a co-benefit of reducing the pH, there's less ammonia loss. So the next thing is to try to scale that up. We've seen it worked in the bottles. We've seen it worked at the pilot scale. Can it work at a full farm? So we're back to this setup, and we're testing low dose acidification through a project that's funded through the Dairy Research Cluster here in Canada. So this is the approach that we used. This is sulfuric acid that's sold as fertilizer for the greenhouse industry. That's gravity fed well into the tank, well, it was about half full, while the tank was being mixed. We also had the methane sensor running as well as hydrogen sulfide sensor, really low concentrations of hydrogen sulfide, and we also were able to track the effect on methane. So what's the impact on the manure composition? We can see that here. This is the after analysis, and I've just circled the things that changed the most. So the pH decreased by a little more than 1 unit at first. The sulfur increased by 4 times, and the sulfate concentration increased 10 times. So in a lot of places, sulfur is now becoming a nutrient that needs to be added. So we're adding it to the manure instead of adding it in the field. The pH change was temporary. We only added the acid once. You can see the pH dropped sharply and then gradually increased over the following month and a half. What effect did that have on methane? Here we can compare 2 years of measurement. The black line is the methane production over time in the top graph. And in week 28, you can see where we have about a 77% methane emission reduction year over year. That was after adding the acid. The effect did wear off because manure was continuously being added into the tank and we didn't add any more acid. So the follow-up study that we plan to do is to add acid multiple times to see if we can prevent methane from being produced during the warm season. Even still, when we do some quick calculations, even though we're paying retail for the acid, still works out to a reasonable number in terms of cost per avoided tons of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gas emissions. And just a quick highlight of a project that is underway in Ontario through the Living Labs program, is working with dairy and pork producers across the province to co-develop approaches to make the acidification and other mitigation strategies practical at farm level, and to do the measurements to show that how they've worked. So just to wrap everything up here on the left side about how much methane is actually produced. In the cold regions like the prairies, we found less methane than expected based on the observed versus the expected from calculations. And that's because methane is very sensitive to temperature, and it seems like at low temperature, even less methane is produced than what would be assumed from previous estimates. Crusts that were thought to reduce methane, actually, we see that they tend to be coinciding with high methane production, but they definitely do decrease ammonia emissions. And we've seen the value of long-term data. Options to mitigate methane, certainly biodigestion, anaerobic digestion is a good option if it's suitable to the farm and if it's designed for methane mitigation. Reducing the amount of manure in the warm season, either by spreading, designing a crop rotation that can have manure application at that time, or through things like solid liquid separation or nutrient recovery. These are good options. Reducing the temperature in some ways, I highlighted that. Acidification is very effective at reducing methane at all the scales we've tested so far, and has the co-benefit of reducing ammonia loss, so retaining more nitrogen in the system and supplying sulfur when that's beneficial. I think there's a lot of value in collaborative work between researchers, between research and farmers, and I think there's big potential reductions possible for methane emissions from manure. And that's the end of my slides. Thank you.
That's awesome, Andrew. So thank you. And you've left us some time for some questions here. There are a few in the chat, a few I have myself as well. For starters, Carl asked back when you were mentioning some of the different treatment options about feed additives. And so I know that's not the focus of your work. You're talking on the manure end, but did any of your partners, were they using feed additives? Has that come into any of the work that you've been doing?
Yeah, excellent question. First for dairy, I would say, so we do have a project with collaborating scientists here at Agriculture Canada through the same program that is going to look at combinations of feed additives and how that can reduce emissions from the rumen and the potential downstream effects on manure. One thing I would say, I expect that'll be effective. I think previous studies have shown emission reductions from in the order of 20–25%. But I think the big difference, at least in cool climates like ours, is that the manure emissions are short-lived, and so we can focus mitigation on a couple of months of the year, maybe 2 to 4, maybe 5 months. But feed additives have to be fed year-round all the time to every cow. So that's just something to bear in mind in terms of the difference between the two. On the swine production side, I would say something that we've seen is that it appears that relative to historical estimates from maybe a couple decades ago, that there's less methane production potential from swine manure now than there used to be, and that's probably linked to more efficient feed conversion and diet formulations.
Right on. Carl was also asking about the composting and thoughts on that helping reducing greenhouse gases, the in-barn composting. That is one that we've addressed in this series in previous years, and we do have some recordings there. I don't know if you've done any of that work at all, the in-barn composting and the effects, but if not, they could circle back to look at some previous year sessions.
So like a compost bedded pack, for
Yeah.
example, I mean, the things that come to mind is there's going to be less liquid manure, so there's going to be less methane, but then there's going to be potentially more nitrous oxide from the pack itself. And so how those two things balance off against each other, I don't know, but I think it seems to me like an open question.
Well, And I did want to circle back on that because that's tough, right? We even as government, we run programs and we focus on certain things. And what are we trying to do? Are trying to reduce, nitrous oxide, methane, CO2. Sometimes it's terminology, sometimes it's actually specific focus, but I don't know that there's an answer to that. But you've addressed the fact that yeah, what are we trying to focus on?
I guess the add-on point would be, for a compost bed pack, for example, it's something that you're managing every day or every week at least. And so if there is something that can be done, like once the mechanisms are understood and the actual state is understood, then I think it could be managed probably um, through the management of that system to reduce to improve the total benefit, let's say.
Yeah. So Chris is asking a question about looking to reduce the amount of sulfuric acid that you may have to use. Would a combination of reducing the storage level down in the spring to adding sulfate together, would they help to reduce the actual amount of sulfuric acid you'd need?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, certainly the less manure that's in storage in the summer, the less that would need to be treated. Um, I think the other part of the kind of prescription that I hope to be able to figure out in the coming years is how temperature plays into it. So I think in areas where it's cooler, the rate probably doesn't have to be, it can probably be a lower rate or less often having to add it. Uh, but I think it also depends on what's the objective, right? Like if the objective is to almost completely stop methane production, which I think is probably going to be possible, um, that would require a certain kind of prescription versus just uh, a partial decrease, which might be simpler and less involved.
And Chris asked another question, wondering about N2O loss in the winter. Is it also reduced in the winter? So is there a temperature factor there?
Nitrous oxide has a more complicated temperature factor. Like if it's just cold, I think then there will be, firstly, there's not really much nitrous oxide from liquid systems in the first place. But if there is like a crust or something, or if we're talking about compost, then yeah, there would be nitrous oxide. And then I think freezing and thawing is what leads to a lot of nitrous oxide. But just being cold but not freezing, I think is not going to enhance nitrous oxide. So it just really depends on whether it's freezing and thawing or not.
Okay. David's asking about the aeration systems, and yeah, it was interesting what you showed there of the timing of when you're actually running the system, and bubbling certainly has an effect. His question is, if you ran it constantly, is that going to further help reduce the methane?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we don't have data to show that, but in principle, if it's not anaerobic, then the methanogens will stop being active. But the counter argument, I mean, the counter to that would be at some point you're uh, you're going to start to produce nitrous oxide and lose more ammonia. So
Okay, so on the sulfur, you're adding the sulfuric acid to the manure. You're maybe adding sulfate in some form or another. That sulfur is being added. That's going to come out the other end. It's going to come out the field end as well. Comments on impacts, positive or negative, to that additional sulfur then being spread out on the fields.
yeah, I mean, I think from my conversations that, since there's been a reduction of sulfur deposition from the atmosphere, then there's gradually more soils that are needing sulfur. So if you were going to be buying sulfur and putting it in the field, then you could do the same thing and put it in your manure tank. And potentially have potentially a win-win, right? Now, is there a point where you have too much sulfur? Probably. That's probably going to be looked at case by case, I think.
Right on. So moving forward, where are you going? Probably two questions. Where are you going to focus on? And are you looking for more cooperators? I mean, I know there's probably a few people that would love to say, hey, come to my farm. I'd love you to do that research on my farm. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think going forward, so I mentioned a couple of the projects that we have now. Those are going to continue, and I think it's a nice stage right now, I think, where we have enough knowledge of some of the mechanisms that we and the tools to be able to visualize the methane, which is an invisible gas. We can see it essentially at a farm, and we can know if, let's say, an additive is reducing it or not. And that's a nice, I think that's a unique opportunity to be able to work together with farmers to say, I think we've seen this mechanism is going to work. How do we make that functional at your farm? And then we can see how well it works, and we can kind of adapt do more rapid iterations of, well, this worked. What do we try next? And having multiple farms, sharing information with each other too, I think is good. And we can make course corrections kind of collaboratively to see, what's going to work, that's practical and potentially economical. And so more farms, yes, I think that would be, that's welcome. And there's especially if they're close to Ottawa for sure, or close to someone else who, like someone from Omafra, could make it out. Or if the farmer wants to take something on themselves, sure. We've got different types of sensors that can be helpful to this.
Fantastic. Andrew, we're out of time. Listen, thank you very much for your time. I know we had you on a few years back. I think it was 2022. That was just a recorded session. Here we had you in person. Really appreciate your time. This is important research you're doing, and so I wish you well going forward, and we'll stay in touch with you as to what you're learning. So, folks, this has been a great start to our series. We look forward to seeing you next week, same time, same place, as we look at fine-tuning manure nutrient availability. We've got Kirsten Workman and Corinne Ketterings from Cornell. We're going to look at manure research, helping to quantify the nitrogen replacement value from manure. And it's going to be a very interesting session. So we look forward to seeing you here next week, 2 o'clock, and hope you have a great week between now and then. Cheers.